You're listening to the Straight to Video podcast with Rob Lane.
Hey, what is going on with you all out there? Hope everyone is doing great and keeping busy. And I want to say thank you for spending some time with me here on the Straight to Video podcast. So for the past few episodes, I've been speaking about guests we've got coming up at our 80s video shop in Overton, and that day has finally arrived. So if you're listening to the show when it's released, then tomorrow, the 15th of March, we'll see actor, puppeteer, director, animator, just all-round creative legend, Mike Quinn will be coming along to the shop to sign autographs, take photos with you all, and answer any questions about his incredible career in movies since the very early 80s right through to today. So it made total sense to check in with Mike himself, get him on the podcast, and hear about some of the amazing stories from working on films such as The Great Muppet Caper, Labyrinth, The Dark Crystal, the most recent Beetlejuice Beetlejuice movie, and of course perhaps his biggest role as playing Nien Nunb, Lando Calrissian's co-pilot in Return of the Jedi, and also the more recent Star Wars prequels. It was a real thrill to hear about his career and how he broke into the industry totally through his own drive and ambition, but equally because of the open-mindedness and trust from the legendary late Jim Henson and his team who created the Muppets, who, as you'll hear, Mike befriended even before he'd left school. It's quite the journey he's been on and the films he's been a huge part of, so I hope you really enjoy this episode. If you want to keep up to date with Mike's adventures after this weekend at the shop, then you can find him on Instagram and Facebook, or check out thequinnzone.com. But for now, please enjoy my straight-to-video chat with Mike Quinn.
I always enjoyed puppets, even as a small kid. You know, we grew up with Punch and Judy and all the usual suspects of puppet shows on TV before I was even going to school. I had a teddy bear that I used to sort of move around like it was a puppet to bring it to life. So, I mean, that kind of goes back to just being a few years old, really. So I used to make puppets when I was a kid out of like paper bags, and I had a glove puppet show that I used to do in parks and at talent shows for like the BBC and such when I was like maybe 8 or 9 as well.
That was for the BBC?
Yeah, like, you know, auditions and stuff.
Right.
I was absolutely terrible. It was like a 2-part act. Half was like a magic show, and then the other half was this glove puppet show that I'd written, and it was in like a booth and everything. But I was terrible.
You have to be terrible to start off.
I was absolutely awful. But at the same time, I was also obsessed with cartoons and animation and Disney and that kind of thing. So they kind of came together in 1976 when Muppet Show first started. So I would be, what would I be like, 12, 13? So it was like kind of like living animation, really.
We're not in anything like it at that kind of scale. I guess we'd had like Thunderbirds and all the Jerry Anderson stuff.
Yeah, which I also loved and thought it was great, you know. So any kind of puppets I always liked anyway. Yeah, so that's kind of how it all started, really, I think. It was just always there.
Do you have brothers and sisters who share the same love, or was you only child?
I have a sister. She's 2 years older than me, but she was also in the biz. She was a singer and did some acting in some pantos when she was a kid at the Palladium. And she was at Croydon with Mike and Bernie Winters. And so I was around a lot of that stuff. She actually had a ventriloquist doll as well, a ventriloquist dummy, depending on whether you like to call them dolls or dummies or figures. I used to play around with that when no one was around and work all the mechanisms where it could like wink and blink and the eyes turn and the mouth could move. So it was kind of like an early animatronic in a way, you know, an early sort of string and lever controls that kind of worked all the things on the face. So she was doing that when I was a kid.
Do you think being in that environment, if she's working with like well-known people and stuff like that, did that give you an option to see this as a career from a young age?
Not really, because that was sort of a focus that she had. And then I just sort of went off on this whole separate tangent of puppets. And that just also led me down that road, really, I suppose, into entertainment. I don't know if it influenced in some way, but I kind of took my own path. And, you know, whereas hers was sort of led by our mother and she was a kid and stuff, mine was more sort of led by me, really, and my own obsessions. Hers was more as a child performer, and mine was once I became a teenager and got older. So it's almost coincidental.
Was your family supportive, though, of it? 'Cause, I mean, we're talking back in like the late 70s, early 80s, before college courses to study such creative paths.
I don't think... How do I answer that? Let's have a think about that. I mean, they kind of left me to it, I suppose.
Right.
Put it that way.
Just stay out of trouble.
Yeah, I mean... Not even. So I was pretty well left to my own devices, really.
Did that give you almost the confidence, I've got to prove myself?
No, I didn't have to prove myself to anyone. This was just not doing puppets was not an option for me. So this was for me. It wasn't about anyone else. It's like, I've got to do this. If it can't be Muppets, it'll be my own stuff or some other kind of puppetry, but I have to do this kind of work now. So I guess I first saw it when I was around 12-ish or so. And then once I got to be 13 and 14, then it became more serious for me. Once I was 15, it's like, yep, that's it. 14, 15, I knew that was it. I absolutely want to do puppetry in some form or other. So no one else really had a say in it. It was all pure obsession and focus and will, really.
I heard you got a genuine taste of the Muppet Show from being on set when you were just 13 years old. How did you find out the show was being filmed near you?
Yeah, I remember reading something at one point, probably a national paper, saying that, they were filming at Elstree, ATV Studios in Boreham Wood. My dad had a job where his company were providing something for ATV. So he had to deal with the accountant or something when they were supplying ATV. And that was my way in, basically. So once we got our first visit, then I would be continually annoying this accountant to visit on a regular basis, basically, at least kind of every other week at that point. So this would be the beginning of 1980, which was the final season of Muppet Show. I was 15. I was still at school. So I would have, what we, I guess, called back then work experience, but I'd have days off school or I'd go visit, watch them tape the shows. But I would also sort of, to help, I guess, grease the wheels, I would bribe my way into the studio, literally like chocolates and cigarettes. I mean, imagine that, buying cigarettes. So that's kind of how it worked. And yeah. So I would be a regular visitor and they would get to know me there, basically. I brought puppets along that I'd made at home out of my pocket money, and Jim Henson and the other guys would put the puppets on and work them and encourage me. And the puppet makers in the workshop, they all got to know me, basically.
A very welcoming environment then.
Yeah, because that's how Jim was. It was always a very creative space, and very nurturing. And everyone there sort of came from different independent backgrounds anyway.
Yeah. I don't think many people realize that it was actually filmed in the UK because you associate it as an American show. But like a lot of the American networks, they'd passed on it. And was it Lou Grade who liked the idea and said, let's shoot it in the UK?
Yeah, well, they'd already done a whole bunch of things for Lou Grade anyway, some TV specials. There was like the Julie Andrews Hour, Des O'Connor, I think, had a special with them. So a few things they'd done already with Lou Grade in there, like from 1974 and 75. So Lou Grade just loved the idea of it and took a chance with Jim. I mean, Lou and ATV, I guess, they understood the US market and the American market and syndication at that time. So it was certainly made with that in mind to sell. I think it sold in like 120 countries or something. It was the most successful live entertainment show of its time, I think, and also the most expensive at that time as well.
Was it on? I was trying to think. I initially thought it was on Saturday evenings, but it was on Sunday evenings.
Originally, I want to say it was Friday evenings. That's how I remember it anyway. So that would be my Friday night all set up.
I think it was drawing audiences of like 14 million, which is unreal.
It was a lot for sure. Yeah, it was amazing, really. Definitely evolved. And then, of course, I made the Muppet movie in, was it 78, 79 or thereabouts? And it was, released 79. And that was a great success as well. And then Lou Grade raised the Titanic with ITC Films. It lost him so much money that he kind of wanted another Muppet film to help him make some more money back. So he went to Jim and said, I want a Muppet movie too, please. And Jim said, well, I want to make my fantasy film, The Dark Crystal, please. So they said, okay, I'll make your movie if you make mine, and shook on it. And that's how we sort of made the two back to back at Elstree with the same crew. So Muppet Caper first and then The Dark Crystal.
I didn't realize Lou Grade was so intertwined in all that work back then. That's amazing.
Oh, very much so. Yeah. And Lou Grade, he also broadcast Thunderbirds. So, I mean, he had a big history of all that and bringing Americans over for his shows, but also Bernard Delfont, who was his, I think, brother, would bring over in the 50s and 60s, Laurel and Hardy and Abbott and Costello and all these other, Danny Kaye, to tour the UK circuit. So they were very much, of that sort of old school entertainment variety sort of mindset. And Lou himself was a clog dancer, I think, in the music halls back in the day.
You could see all that kind of influence, the Muppet Show, that all had that vibe vibe about it.
Yeah, I mean, it was lightning in a bottle, really, wasn't it? The right people at the right time in the right place. And that's kind of how it happened. And Jim was the same way, too. You know, he was the right person for the time, for sure.
I always think it's cool growing up, like the fact we all knew who Jim Henson was. He wasn't just a name on the poster or in the credits. We all knew the influence he had on it. He was there. You had Kermit, you had Miss Piggy, you had Fozzie, and you had Jim Henson. He was as large as life as they were as well.
Yeah, he understood the way that Walt Disney had done that for the Disney franchise. So he understood that. And so that's when he sort of got into, Jim Henson's Muppets rather than just the Muppets.
Do you remember your first encounter with him?
Yeah, first one was actually, I would be 13. I was 13. They hadn't quite started season 2 of the Muppet Show yet, but they were, I think, about to. And all the 5 main Puppeteers were making a live appearance on the Kenny Everett radio show at Capital Radio one Saturday. And they announced it the week before, so I got along there, got on the bus from Enfield, where I was growing up and living, and went to Euston Road, Capital Radio, and intercepted them in the lobby. Met Kenny Everett afterwards as well.
Superb.
And that was my first encounter with them.
Oh, incredible. And what was your first encounter with him on set? Was Jim always there?
Yeah, he was always there, definitely, yeah. In between visiting Muppet Show and seeing them at Capital Radio, when the Muppet movie premiered, they had the Royal World premiere at the Leicester Square Theatre in London. It's now a hotel, sadly. But I called up Lou Grade's office and bought tickets with my pocket money and went along to the premiere.
You were like totally hands-on with all this stuff.
Yeah. It's like, this is what I'm doing. So I remember Richard Hunt signed my movie ticket and Spike Milligan was there as well. So he signed my ticket too. After that, the very next time would have been my first visit to Muppet Show, which was Wonder Woman, Linda Carter. So they were shooting that. So that was my sort of first time meeting them all on set, I guess.
Speaking of the premieres, how did premieres back in the day compare to premieres nowadays?
Well, the thing is weird because when I go back now and search through archives of that evening, there's very little out there. There's like a newspaper clipping with Princess Anne meeting Kermit and that kind of thing, but there's like hardly anything. Whereas now it's all, all about the media and socials and it's everywhere, but it's really hard to find anything on that night online anywhere. So I find that a bit strange. So they were, I guess, smaller in some ways then than they are now.
Was your first actual working gig with Henson's, was that the Muppet Caper then? Was that your first when you was actually hired to work for Henson?
Yeah, that's right. Yes, they basically finished Muppet Show in the summer of, it was, I think, June of 1980. And I coincidentally finished school right around that same time. School basically gave up on me and said, well, you're on your own, kid. Good luck. We don't want you anymore. We can't help you.
Even though you'd shown all that initiative?
They knew exactly. And they're like, I remember going to their, what do they call it, where you sort of meet with their career people and all that kind of thing, your last year and everything. They're like, no, we can't help you. You're just doing what you can and have a nice life.
Did they give you encouragement to do it, or they were just like...
Not really.
It was like unknown territory for them as well, I guess.
They didn't get it. Like, you're supposed to work in a factory,
Exactly.
They didn't understand. I did, however, spend the last 2 years. I was the first boy in that entire school, and probably the last, I suspect. Because back then, of course, the boys took woodwork and metalwork, and the girls took, I think it was like needlework or sewing or whatever they called it, and cooking or something like that. It's all different, of course. But I thought, I wonder if I could make puppets on school time. If I did sewing instead of this metalwork nonsense, I can actually make puppets and have fun doing all that stuff instead of all this stuff I don't want to do. So it was quite a fight with the school to get them to agree to that, actually. And they resisted. Finally, their excuse was, well, I've never taught a boy before, from the teacher. But anyway, they had to kind of give in. And I did all that stuff and made lots of puppets. And that was great. So I left school. They finished the TV show. And then they literally went right across the street to the film studio to start on The Great Muppet Caper. And they were actually initially doing locations first before most of the studio shooting. So I basically had an envelope with a job application. Dear Jim Henson, I'd like to become a puppeteer for you. And I put in photos of the puppets I'd made and a little newspaper clipping from my local paper and got it all in this nice brown envelope and hunted them down. They were shooting the scene in the village pond where they land in the crates from the airplane and land in the duck pond. So they were shooting that. It took me like all day to find out how to get there on buses. I ended up getting there like maybe an hour and a half before the end of the shoot or something, late afternoon. The shoot came to an end and it was Jim's 44th birthday that day. And so people were like giving him cards and things from the crew. Then I stepped up in line and gave him my envelope. And I think he thought it was a birthday card, you know. So he was like, oh, thank you very much. And that was the end of that. So I went back to the bus stop and waited for my eternal buses and coaches to take me home. I think I got home about 10:30 that night. And I watched all the limos drive past me. But 2 weeks later, I got a call from David Laser, the exec producer, the Henson guy, saying, we'd like to put you in on some background stuff for a week. You know, are you interested?
Let me think about it for all of 2 seconds.
Yeah, I'm like, no, I don't think so. I've changed my mind. And so that's kind of how it started, really.
That's unreal.
That's how Jim was, though. You know, he was that way. He was like that. He just saw potential in people, I think, and gave them a chance.
I just imagine him sitting in his office opening all his birthday cards, then he comes across your job application.
Well, I found out years later, I didn't know this until much more recently, that Jim was concerned he was taking me away from, a college education. Because, of course, every American has to have that, apparently. But this was my, education, learning from the masters. That was a concern of his that I didn't know about. And apparently what he'd said to people about me when he hired me was, well, he's here all the time anyway. I might as well use him anyway. So, and he had a point, I think. I mean, I'd sort of self-taught somewhat anyway at home, so I at least knew some of the basics. I just didn't know how to do monitor work and how to assist other people and how films were made and that kind of thing. So I sort of had to sort of learn a lot on the job. But at least I wasn't starting from day one, I suppose. And I guess you saw that.
How was it for you learning how everything comes together behind the scenes? Some might say it takes away the magic, but do you see it the opposite way around? For you, that is the magic, creating something that isn't real, but bringing it to life for the audience.
Oh, I was always peeling back, and I still to this day, it's like, I want to know how this stuff's done. How is this made? So I was always about that. Apparently, when I was like 2 years old, I unscrewed the back of the TV set to see, I guess, the people inside. I don't know. That was back then when they had the valves and all the, the bulbs and things. And so I could have probably electrocuted myself.
I need to see how this thing works. Got to figure it out.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm always about that. I always want to know how the cake is baked, how the cake is made, I guess.
We mentioned after the Muppet Caper, you got to work on, I consider, a groundbreaking movie, The Dark Crystal, which was such an epic vision for its time and still looks stunning to this day. How was that in terms of scale compared to the Muppets? And was it at all daunting for everyone involved? Because Jim had this vision in his head, but you're in unknown territory in a way.
It's the first animatronic, I guess, all puppet film in a way as well. Certainly all live action animatronics. He kind of invented animatronics, the term animatronics, for that. And so it hadn't been done before. And yeah, we did a lot of film tests, like when we were shooting the Muppet Caper in the evenings, we'd do then film tests for the Dark Crystal to check out makeups and textures and lighting and movement. We had a lot of movement workshops as well, because we couldn't just do the Muppet, walk along and, everything like the podlings all had to be very realistic, and the lip sync had to be much more like naturalistic, I suppose. So there was a lot of work we had to do to get there. Yeah, on the one hand, it was absolutely terrifying, like figuring out how to do these skexes. Like each one had at least 3 puppeteers assisting on it. So how do they walk? How do they turn their heads? How do you get the faces to act? And what happens with the eyes? And how do you make them blink realistically? And how do you do all that stuff? We had to sort of figure that out. We'd all been used to doing Muppets for so long, I guess. So it was on the one hand, yeah, it was terrifying. But on the other hand, it was just so exciting. It's like, wow, we knew we were doing something completely new.
Breaking new ground every day when you're going into work. It's like, what's going to happen today?
Yeah, and how do we solve this problem and how do we make it look good? Yeah, I mean, it was amazing. It really was. So everything that I'd learned in the first few years with Muppet Caper and The Dark Crystal was great animatronic training. And then, of course, Return of the Jedi afterwards, which was then mixing animatronics in a real human environment rather than the puppet environment. Set the groundwork for the rest of my career, basically.
You mentioned Return of the Jedi. That's kind of similar to Labyrinth in a way, where it's mixing human elements with the puppet elements.
Yeah. The big difference was that the Star Wars films are human-centric, and the creatures and animatronics and puppets sort of have to fit into that world. Whereas with Labyrinth, it was Jim Henson directed and produced film, so the humans had to fit into the puppet world, So puppet first and human second in a way. The sets were built to accommodate puppeteers and raised and all that kind of thing. So, and Jim knew how to shoot puppets. He just knew how to do that. He knew how to break up a scene, how far you could go before you needed to stop the take or whatever. And then he knew when to come in and do a nice, money shot of the head and shoulders of the character and when to get the close up on them. He knew how to break up a scene for action, how far puppets could go before they had to be re-rigged or reset or whatever. He understood all that. So this was his world. He was just like a kid in a toy shop, really. He had the best time ever.
Was the shooting of Labyrinth a lot smoother than Dark Crystal?
It was just different, really, I think. There were, of course, quite a few humans in there. And we were using a bit more radio control, still hand puppets, a lot of costumes. I mean, they both went smoothly, I guess. I don't know if one was smoother than the other. They were just slightly different. I think the Dark Crystal, while creatively, of course, it was a massive success. And now it's remembered and respected as being this iconic, groundbreaking movie. At the time, of course, it didn't make a lot of money. Universal didn't really know how to market it and pitch it. So it didn't really do that well financially. It didn't do well at all. So sadly. So I think, just 4 years later, Labyrinth is a completely different type of film to Dark Crystal in every way. Just 4 years later. But it was, I think, he was trying to answer what people might have seen as the failings of the Dark Crystal in Labyrinth. So that's why there was, humans and songs and comedy, So he was trying to elevate everything and move things forward, which is what Jim was always about every time. He was always about doing something new and taking things to the next level and always happy to try new technologies and take risks on things. He was great.
We mentioned Return of the Jedi. We, of course, know you as portraying Nien Nunb, Lando Calrissian's co-pilot in the Millennium Falcon. But you're also key to many other parts of that film, working alongside Tim Rose in Jabba's Palace and also on his Admiral Akbar character.
Yeah, so I did the close-up Reese character in Jabba's Palace. Paul Springer was the costume version, the wide-shot version, and then a few other little bits. The little snail thing above Jabba, above 3PO there in the alcove. I was working that as well. And assisting Tim with Admiral Akbar on cable controls. Baby Ewok, bits of Jabba here and there on a couple of things. What else? Assisting Frank with Yoda, of course. He requested me for that, and I was a huge fan of Yoda in Empire Strikes Back. And because I'd assisted Frank with Fozzie Bear, it was the same kind of job. Frank would do the head, and then someone else would do the right hand of Fozzie Bear like a glove, and Yoda was exactly the same thing. So I did the same job with Yoda in Return of the Jedi, so I got to be his right hand for that.
Still unmatched now when you watch it today, Empire Strikes Back and Return of the Jedi. The Yoda character is there alongside everybody else.
Yeah, well, in some ways it wasn't sort of built so much as it was a puppet, but it was approached a little differently in that Stuart Freeborn, he was a makeup guy, and so he sculpted that more as, I guess, from that realistic sort of viewpoint. So you were sort of there already visually. You had this thing that no one had seen before, really. And then Frank's brilliant approach about, less is more with Yoda and making him much more realistic and isolating everything. I don't think Frank approached Yoda as a puppet in any way. He knew the restrictions and what it could do and couldn't do, but he just approached it as a character, and he was the actor for that character. So everything had all its specific beats and a reason, and it was just acted as its own entity, as a real character. And I think that was the secret of Yoda's success, really, was Frank's approach to it and his technical prowess to be able to pull that off.
Do you remember the effect the first Star Wars film had on you when you first saw it?
Oh, yeah. I saw it at the cinema. And I think I went back and saw it a second time and maybe even a third. I loved it, yeah.
Do you remember what cinema it was?
Yeah, it was the Odeon in Boston, Lincolnshire. I was staying at my grandmother's, and there was an Odeon cinema there. I don't know if it's still there anymore. Probably not.
Did you know what to expect going in? Had your friends seen it or anything beforehand?
No, I saw it right near the beginning, so I knew it was some space thing. Yeah, I thought it was great, though. I mean, I was, 11, so I was a great age for that, too. Yeah, it's great. Little did I know, And then, of course, when all the images started to come out for Empire Strikes Back before the movie came out, and there was all these pictures of Yoda, I was like, what is this? And I knew it was Frank Oz. Like, how is this going to move? So I was like absolutely obsessed with that.
You're already dissecting it, trying to figure out what was happening.
Yeah, like, what's going on here? What's it going to be like? We just had still images and that was it. So I ended up seeing Empire Strikes Back many more times just to see the Yoda bits. And of course, back in the, 1830s, I think, when that first came out, you could sit through the movie and just watch it come back around again, So I'd just spend all day waiting for the Yoda scenes to come up.
The role you played of Nien Nunb turned into such an iconic part, despite only being on screen for a short while. As kids, we knew who he was. He was a very important mail-away figure, which always made an impact. But on screen, he really owns his time. I only recently found out Nien Nunb was initially just a puppet too, just his top half, which you can see, and not you in an actual full suit, which you'd later do in the more recent trilogy. Again, that's a testament to how your work comes across on screen. I just thought it was you in the full suit.
Yeah, they didn't really have the technology to get the mouth working right back then. They sort of could have done like a basic crude cable control or something, and that would have been it. But, he'd been shot already with someone else in the background of a couple of scenes, but there was no articulation, so his eyes didn't blink. He didn't have a moving mouth. It was literally just a pull-on sort of foam latex covering sort of mask, and that was it. But George liked the look of that guy, and he knew that Lando needed someone as a co-pilot because Chewie was gone elsewhere. So he picked that character, and I was falling around Phil Tippett's workshop one evening, late afternoon at Elstree. Phil was in charge of all the creatures, of course. And I came across those guys, the two Nien Nunb masks next to each other. And so this guy's really great. He sort of he didn't have his helmet on, so he just had a bald head. He reminded me of Dopey a little bit from Snow White with the sort of big eyes. And he said, yeah, George just pulled him aside to be in the Falcon, but he's got dialogue and it's coming up in a few weeks. So he was saying, I think what we'll do is just put an oxygen mask over his mouth and put air bladders in the cheeks, and then that way we can get around it. And I thought, that's not so good. So I took the mask and I put my hand inside it, and I was able to sort of manipulate the mouth a little bit and said, look, we can actually do it as a puppet and make him talk. And he thought, that's a really cool idea. And he saw what I was trying to do. And he said, do you want to finish fitting that out, sort of make it work as a Head and Shoulders puppet, just as a test, and we can show it to George maybe in a week's time. So I said, yeah, absolutely. So that's what I did. I glued in little thumb grips and things in there and built out a little foam skull to rest on the back of the hand and sort of fixed it all onto these Head and Shoulders. And we did a film test with George about a week later. And they had the other guy in the other mask next to me with the hand puppet. And George literally just had us both do whatever he was asking us, look over there, look over here, be surprised, happy, say something. And so we both did that next to each other. And then I said, well, you could actually put eye blinks in here on a cable control. We were still using mostly cables, like brake cables back then for everything. You actually do see, when you see the back of Nien Nunb and Lando flying through hyperspace, you can actually see his ears kind of wiggle. And George really kind of liked the idea of that. And I guess he was convinced that the puppet could speak and everything and that it looked good. So, and Stuart Ziff was their ILM technical guy who was there as a go-between between Phil Tippett and ILM in California. So he asked Phil, how long do you need to mechanize that and get it back to us? And I think he had like 2 weeks to ship it back to California, put eye blink mechanisms in there and ear wiggles and just make sure the top torso was all working with the costume. And it came back 2 weeks later, and then guess I had got myself the job. So that's sort of how it worked, really. Yeah, and the script wasn't even, his dialogue wasn't written out. They just knew that he needed to speak an alien language. And so the script sort of said, he chatters a liquid language, and then Lando's answers were the same. So on the day of the shoot, because they were running behind, actually, Richard Marquand was on stage 5 shooting the Rancor pit scenes. So George actually directed the cockpit scenes himself, which isn't even in the making of book, I don't think. So on the morning of, I had my script. It was 5 pages or whatever, all the different scenes. And I'd written in pencil so I could erase it really quickly if it wasn't right. But I said, can I just speak in English? I know we're going to replace my voice later anyway. Can I just say these things because it'll help with my emotion and with the acting and the editing? And he looked over what I'd written. He was sitting in his director's chair and just looked up and said, yeah, that'll be fine. So I was like, yes. So I basically wrote my own dialogue, and that's what we shot on the day in the Falcon.
Return of the Jedi, it's over 40 years old now. I mean, Star Wars is such a huge part of a lot of our memories, very important in our lives.
How can it be over 40 years old? I'm only 35 now.
Well, I don't know. I got my math wrong somewhere.
Doesn't make sense, does it?
But when did you see this new wave of nostalgia and love for the films kick into gear with conventions such as Comic-Con, Star Wars Celebration, an appearance at the 80s video shop, which must be a real career high?
It's going to be. It's definitely going to be. After Saturday, it's downhill for me.
When did that all become a thing for you?
I started signing during the odd convention in about 2000. I think Texas was my first one. It hadn't really come back around as a nostalgia thing yet. You still had your hardcore fans at that point. We had the special editions. So, it was still a thing. But it wasn't until, I suppose, I don't know, it seems like it needs about 30 odd years or so. And then it suddenly becomes this whole, nostalgia thing. Maybe it sort of started to really get serious once the final trilogy started to become a thing. Then it sort of brought people back to the original trilogy again, I think. So maybe it's in the last 10 years or so that it's really come back around again. And the same for Labyrinth and Little Shop and Roger Rabbit and all those things. They've just had this whole nostalgia for the 80s. Rightly so. That stuff holds up.
It's magical time. I quickly wanted to ask, away from puppeteering, you're credited as having a role in the movie 1408 with John Cusack and Samuel L. Jackson. Is that true?
No, IMDb
No.
is terrible. It's absolute rubbish. And I keep trying to correct credits in there, and other people put things in that are wrong, and they take away things that I put in they shouldn't be removing. IMDb is not a reliable source in any way. At one point, they had me acting in Cat on a Hot Tin Roof with whatever his name is, and I was way too young for that. And that, for some reason, that one keeps coming back, even though I've removed it. It's just nonsense.
Wow.
And there's things that I have done that aren't in there that should be.
Yeah, I mean, because one thing, you most recently worked on the new Beetlejuice movie, Puppeteering Bob Shrinker.
Well, yeah, for the end scene I did, and then we did other bits and pieces. Yeah, there was another puppeteer who did Bob in the earlier scene. I did him for the end scene.
It's credited as Nick Kellington.
Nick Kellington, yeah. Nick, it was in the costume the whole time. So he was wearing, it was his hands and arms, and then the head sat on top of his. So Nick was inside Bob the entire time.
I actually found out that Nick is originally from Alfreton.
Nick's great. He's done a lot of, he was also, of course, a Teletubby, but he's a great costume performer. And, we worked with him again on Acolyte as well. And, of course, the last trilogy. But he's really good in both suits and costumes and also prosthetics, too. He's done quite a few characters in makeups, too. And so then when we did all the Beetlejuice promo work, we did quite a few things. We did car commercials for the States and Denny, the restaurants, TV appearances for like The Bachelorette and things like that. And then we did a whole bunch of other commercials, cell phones we did. So Nick and I worked together a lot on Bob for all the promo work as well, which was amazing. We worked well together. I worked with Nick on some other, basically, he's in the costume, I'm working the face. He has an earpiece so he can hear me talking to him, so I can relay, whatever's going on or where the camera is or if we're about to go or to tweak any performances and that kind of thing. So, yeah, we work well together. I'm sure there'll be more at some point. You should definitely get him along.
Yes, I think he moved to Liverpool at some point, somebody said. But yeah, he's originally from Alfreton, went to school there back in the day.
Excellent. I shall check in with him later.
Do you think Beetlejuice is a good example of how the industry is leaning now with a combination of practical and digital effects? It's kind of combining the two.
I wouldn't say Beetlejuice is a good example of combining the two because it was almost all practical effects. All the creature stuff was all practical. Everything was in camera, basically. So that's not typical. Now, there wasn't much CG in the posts in Beetlejuice. I think hardly anything, in fact. So that was a rare thing. And I think it's great. Being all practical is absolutely wonderful. But going back to maybe other movies like the newer Star Wars we've been doing, I'd say it probably is a good example of that. Puppets never went away. Animatronics never really left, even though people thought they had. We were always still doing puppet effects and things like that. And I knew that the pendulum would eventually swing back when everybody gets it out of the system. And there's a maturing in some ways and an understanding of what everything it can do. And so we've sort of reached that point generally in the industry now where we use puppets for what they do best. If there's something that physically you can't do with your own anatomy or speed-wise or safety-wise on set, then yeah, you can use post-production to help that out or enhance that or make something a little bit different. A lot of the time it's used for things like set extensions or removing, rods and heads and things like that. But in the last decade plus, 10, 15 years, pretty well all the creatures, for the most part, that we've performed have been all in camera.
Great that it's turning back that way, for sure. It's awesome.
Yeah, it is much better. There's nothing like having a practical, what you see on camera is what you get. You can light it. There's something real about it, even though it might not be able to do as much as a CG character, but often they do too much anyway. And there's no post-production, it's like, okay, there it is in camera, just working next to the actors, and it's great for the actors too. Yeah, it's a win-win for everyone. And then also the fans want it too, for the most part, they want to see the real practical creatures again. And every once in a while, people will assume that what we've done has been CG. And I have to say, no, it was real in camera, it's great.
Mike, thanks ever so much for chatting with me. It's been great to hear a little bit about your career. I could go on. There's loads of bits I could pick apart.
I know. We haven't even got halfway through the 1980s yet. I guess we'll have to do a part 2.
It's crazy. But I look forward to seeing you at the video shop on Saturday. When was the last time you was in a video shop?
Oh, gosh, probably the 80s. No, probably maybe the 90s. I remember there was one in Enfield Town and I was renting. You had to put down a large deposit with the store before you could rent a videotape. Back then, 20, 30 pounds or something, in the 80s was a massive amount of money. I guess it was like in case you broke the tape or ran off with it or something. And I remember one point going back to rent a new tape or something, and they'd gone out of business and gone off with my deposit. So that was probably one of the last times. But we also had Blockbuster in the States. I was living in the States for 20 odd years and spent the early part of that visiting Blockbuster stores.
Well, hopefully Saturday will bring back some memories. I'm sure you'll see some of your own films on the shelves in there. It's going to be very, very cool. But I look forward to seeing you, and hopefully it'll be a good turnout.
Yeah, I'm just looking forward to it and hearing what people have to say about everything and seeing what they're interested in as they come in the store, what kind of things they want to bring or talk about. So it's going to be really interesting. So yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Excellent. Well, I'll speak to you soon.
Thanks so much. Do appreciate it. Thanks for sorting it all out. I'll see you in a few.
The force was certainly strong on today's podcast, thanks to our guest Mike Quinn, and I really appreciated his time to chat. I look forward to hearing even more stories when he visits our 80s video shop this Saturday, March the 15th, from 12 noon until 4 p.m, where you can all come along, get autographs and selfies, as well as chatting to him yourself. We're super proud to have guests like Mike at the shop, and everyone we've had previously and also upcoming. We hope he gives a more personal and intimate meeting, as the big events, for me at least, they're getting so busy, so hopefully ours are a little more low-key and easygoing. If you missed this weekend with Mike, then check out thequinzone.com, or you can find him at another event in the local area when he presents a screening of Labyrinth with our pal, Boo the Bad Guy, at the Salt Box in Nottingham on Sunday the 11th of May, which looks like a really fun event. Check out Boo the Bad Guy on Facebook for all the info on that. And following our weekend with Mike, we've also announced another guest for April the 12th, when OG Gladiator Cobra will be coming along to the shop. And then on Saturday the 31st of May, we're visited by actor Charlie Schlatter from The Delinquents, Diagnosis Murder, and he was also the voice of E.T. in the recent holiday reunion, so that's going to be a great one. It's all going on at the 80s Video Shop, so please keep up to date on social media, simply at 80s Video Shop, and a big thank you to everyone that continues to support us at the shop and also on Patreon. So that's it for this episode of the podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and until we chat again, make sure to always be kind, please rewind and unwind, and I'll speak to you all real soon.